Hello? Hello? I don't know, just right? Sounds pretty good?
Yeah.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Nick Dembowski. Let me take off my microphone. I'm Nick Dembowski, president of the Kingsbridge Historical Society. Welcome. This is our first event of 2024, our 75th year as an organization. There are some people here in this room that have been members for most of those 75 years. That's true.
Great.
You have lettering all over you.
What's that?
You have lettering all
Oh,
over
Scoop this up.
all right.
you.
Okay. So for our 75th anniversary year, we have some cool stuff coming up. So after today, in a few weeks, we're having Kevin Haratic, your neighbor here in Spite and Idle, is giving a talk on bringing oysters back to the Bronx. That's here on the 11th. There's Kevin back there. On April 25th, we are opening up an exhibit of neighborhood panoramas. That's an example of one. We have a lot going up, and so come out for our grand opening of our exhibit. But if you can't make that, we'll be open every Sunday in May for you to come check it out. With the exception of one Sunday, which is the 19th, when we're having a benefit concert of beautiful classical music by the Street and Broadway Chamber Players. That should be really great, beautiful, great acoustics in here, beautiful setting for some fine classical music. I want to thank a few people. Councilmember Dinowitz for the discretionary grant that paid for the microphone, the screen, projector, the laptop, the heating, the electrical bill. It's been very helpful. If you run into Councilmember Dinowitz, give him a thanks for us. That's being run through the Department of Youth and Community Development of New York City, so thanks to them as well. So I also have to thank Stephanie Coggins for keeping the flowers going outside and our garden beds. They look very nice. Thank you so much for that. Of course, Earl Harewood, the caretaker of Edgehill, caretaker for a very long time. He's sitting back there in the back row. He's here a couple of days a week at least, working on the grounds and in the building. Earl and I, for the first time in I don't know how long, this room has light bulbs that are all the same wattage and type. Don't ask us how we did that, but we did. So that brings us to tonight's talk, the epic story of a New York City or a Bronx street corner. This has been one of my main areas of fascination with the history of this neighborhood. You know, I'm fascinated with the history of this neighborhood. This is like the juicy nugget of it all, you know. This is like the most historic street corner in our neighborhood. So I'm going to hopefully share some information that you don't already know about it. I've been sharing information about the street corner with my wife for like the last 12 years. And every time I learn something new, and I tell her, and I swear it's the first time I'm telling her, she's like, you already told me that, at least 3 times. But I knew she was listening, and the way I knew she was listening is that for my birthday in 2021, she commissioned this watercolor of the Dunkin Donuts on West 230 and Broadway. Which, if I'm being perfectly honest, doesn't capture my fascination with the corner, but it shows that she was listening. And for a local historian, for someone to listen to you, the corner of West 230th Street and Broadway, today at Dunkin Donuts. Just going to give you a few different angles here. We're looking northwest on 230th Street. There's the corner on your right, and that's 230th Street in the foreground. Another angle of that corner. This is from Broadway, looking pretty much south. And that's the Kingsbridge Post Office there on the right. Let's take a view of a contemporary Google map of the area. That's the corner. Now, some of you may look at this map and ask yourself, isn't New York City supposed to be a grid? This is a real mess. And history and geography are factors in the way the streets run in Kingsbridge. But every map you look at, going back hundreds of years, you'll see on this corner, West 230 Street and Broadway, this hook. And that's really sort of what got me hooked on the history of this site. So I'm going to take this map back 100 years. Do you see the hook?
How do that land get there?
So, yeah, you see there's that hook there, and you'll notice that, well, that corner was waterfront property in 1885. And yet today, it's completely landlocked. So what explains that difference is the big major change that happened in our neighborhood in 1895. And that's the year, well, let me just flip back and forth so you get the difference. So 1895 is when they cut through the Harlem River Ship Canal. See if I can get my pointer over here. Oh, here we go. That ended up chopping Marble Hill, the neighborhood, off of Manhattan. And the Spite and Dival Creek here, which fronted on West 230th and Broadway, this was eventually filled in, making it look like this. And it's, of course, totally landlocked today. I had a student, when I taught at PS24, a fourth grader who lived in the Marble Hill houses across the street from that Dunkin Donuts, and this kid was obsessed with fishing because he was watching those competitive bass fishing shows on ESPN. But I told him, I said, if you were alive 100 years ago, you could fish right outside the front door of the Marble Hill. Where's my pointer? Here we go. So here's the King's Bridge, the first bridge to Manhattan Island, built in 1693. Still standing in 1885 and into the early 20th century.
What year is this?
This is 1885. Let's take it back another 100 years. 1782. Still there, that hook in the road. And you could see a little bit here of why exactly it is that our streets are not a grid. Some of these roads that we drive on and walk on today are old historic roads. And they were just never changed. Or they followed the course of the Spite and Dival Creek, or they avoided going straight over a hill, as in Marble Hill over here. Now, here's another example. Not only do you see that hook in the road in these old maps, but you also see this red dot here, a red rectangle. Now, this talk is mostly going to be about things that happened at that red rectangle. Now, that represents a building. These maps, these last couple maps are maps from the American Revolution. And there was a building there at that time.
Dunkin Donuts?
Close, actually. Close. So, but of course there was a time where there was no road and there was no building. So we're going to take it back. This is from 1777. We're going to take it back another 100 years. To the first map drawn by the New English government of the New York colony. This is right after they took over the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam. And just to orient you to this map, well, it's pretty much the same orientation. You have the Hudson River flowing over here, or up here somewhere in these trees on Spite and Dival. Here's Marble Hill, still attached to the island of Manhattan. So this is the Bronx, and you'll notice a stream flowing through what is today Kingsbridge, emptying into the Harlem River, or Spite and Dival Creek. This would be Tibbetts Brook. And you'll notice something else interesting is, it's labeled Spit and Dival. Today we associate Spite and Dival with more of the neighborhood that's up here on this hill, but back then Spite and Dival meant, well, it's sort of the general area, but the creek in addition. And you'll notice something else which is we have the rushing waters of the Harlem River and the Spike Neville Creek indicated by these lines, and then these little dots here. And those dots represent what was known in the colonial period as the waiting place. So a place at low tide or slack tide that you could actually walk across the Spike and Neville Creek to get from the Bronx, or as it was then known, actually I don't even know what they called it back then, but in the 1660s, but from today's Bronx to Manhattan Island, you could walk across the water. And it was, of course, very important to the native people of the area, the Native Americans, the Muncie and the Lenape and their ancestors. And there's evidence that this spot, this waiting place, was important to them. When the post office was built there in Kingsbridge, a local historian named Theodore Kazimiroff conducted an amateur archaeological dig on the site, and he later wrote about it in this article in the Riverdale Press from 1951, talking about the different sites he excavated. And he said the most notable was the village site that was uncovered in the construction of our new post office at 230th Street on Broadway. I uncovered pottery fragments, arrowheads, and a skeleton of an adult Indian, together with their food remains, such as clam, oyster, and scallop shells. And I believe they later found yet another skeleton in that area. But it was more than just that crossing or that waiting place that made the area attractive to the Muncie people. So these local waterways that you're looking at here, which are colored in blue, this is a map of Westchester County in 1871, back when this whole area was still part of Westchester County. What you'll see is that these waterways, these aren't freshwater waterways. These are tidal estuaries. They may be called rivers and creeks and streams, but at high tide, the water from the ocean, from the Long Island Sound, from New York Harbor, would flood these areas and flood a good deal of Kingsbridge, making them salt marshes. So here I've colored the areas that would be salt marshes in green. And this is probably after the people in the area already had drained a lot of these salt marshes. But if you look even as late as 1871, there's just so much of these salt marshes, and you probably know what I'm talking about when you go to the beach or the seashores, like in Pelham Bay Park, for example. You see that grass growing in salt water on the shore. There's only very few plants like that grass, that Spartina grass, that can grow in salt water, and it's just a remarkable ecosystem full of nutritious mollusks. I think they're mollusks, oysters, mussels. And so the local Lenape or Muncie people had a plentiful food supply here in Kingsbridge to live off of, making that area very attractive. Here's a computer projection of what Tibbetts Brook in Kingsbridge may have looked like in 1609. So I'm sort of thinking this is maybe if you're standing in Gaelic Park looking south. So 1609, of course, the year that Henry Hudson sailed to our area working for the Dutch West India Company. And what made this ecosystem, the salt marsh, attractive to European colonists was the fact that you could basically run your cattle and your pigs and your sheep out there to eat this grass that was self-sown, so you didn't have to plant a whole field of hay. You just send the pigs out there. And the cattle apparently really liked it. So, with the arrival of the Europeans, there came these land deals between the local Muncie and the first colonists. So this is this is the signature page of a 17th century land deed between colonists and the Muncie of our area. This is the deed to Fordham Manor. And those are actually the signatures of the Muncie right here, these marks. You can see the mark of Acapulco, for example. So a land deed today, like we got the deed to this building here, it'll tell you the block and lot number, and it'll tell you the street address. But they didn't have any of that back then, so to describe a parcel of land, they would use natural features like the marked maple tree, or the big rock, or the stream, or they would use the native Lenape place name for a certain spot. So this is the first colonist to live in our area. He bought land here in 1646 from the Lenape, and he's describing, his name is Adrian Vanderdonk, really fascinating character. There are books about this fellow. He advocated for the rights of the colonists here, and fought, how do you say, disputed with Peter Stuyvesant over how to run the colony of New Netherland when it was a Dutch colony. And he's describing his property boundary to the south as Paprinaman, called by our people in spite of the Diable. So there's that word Paprinaman. That's the Lenape place name for the area we're talking about. And as late as 1853, this central part of Kingsbridge, people were still calling it Paprinaman. And they came to use the term, the term island of Paprinaman to describe the center of Kingsbridge. So you may be thinking, all right, well, where's the island? So it really is only a tidal island. So at high tide, these green areas would flood with water, and it would surround this Paprinaman island, making the whole center of Kingsbridge an island. So what made this area attractive to colonists? Very similar to what made it attractive to the Lenape. In fact, here's a real estate ad from 1763. To be sold at public vendue on Wednesday the 20th of April next at the house of Jacob Dykeman at Kingsbridge at 10 o'clock in the forenoon. So there's a sale. And I get a kick out of seeing the things that people found enticing about, a real estate purchase in those days. So it has a great many springs of very fine water on it, 200 acres with fine springs. And if you look at the second highlighted part, it is very pleasantly situated, having an extensive prospect all around. It fronts on the Harlem Creek, in which there is great plenty of fish, oysters, and clams, and is navigable to the city of New York. So pleasantly situated, has a good view. Fronts on the Harlem Creek, full of fish, oysters, and clams. Good places to eat. And is navigable to the city of New York, convenient to New York City. So these are things we see in our real estate ads today. And I thought this was interesting. This is another real estate ad from 1772. Also, this is a farm at Kingsbridge, now in the possession of Mr. Sampson Dykeman. It says it has the advantage of mowing a large quantity of salt hay. So you see, that was something people wanted, etc. And the spring, it abounds with most excellent bass, shad, and herring, and crabs and oysters. Most part of the year are caught in great abundance. Imagine being able to walk down 230th Street and grab some fresh oysters right off the ground. So I showed you that very first map, the 1664 map drawn by the new English government of New York Colony. Here's a map from 20 years after that. This one blew my mind when I saw this map. I went to see it in person down at the Collegiate Church Corporation, which is the sort of the entity that was the first Dutch church in the colony of New Amsterdam. And they have old documents from the early days of New York's history, including the 1684 map. And again, just to orient yourself, we have the Hudson River over here, Spite Dial Creek, winding its way around Marble Hill. So we're about up there right now. Here's the Harlem River. And you could see in just 20 years, there's a lot more happening up here. So this has echoes of that earlier map with the dots crossing the Harlem River, but there's a word here, which is upside down, so hard to read, but it says ferry. And on the today's Bronx side, there is a building right there. Now, the most annoying thing about this map to me is the fact that it got ripped at some point, and right down the middle, and this is the seam, and somebody decided they were going to glue it back together by overlapping one side over the other, right in the part I find the most interesting. So what's the deal with the ferry in that house on the other side? So that building is really exactly where 230th Street and Broadway is today. And the ferry, this is the ferry as it stood in 1765 at 125th Street in Harlem. And there had been a ferry down at 125th Street in Harlem in the 1660s, operated by a man named Johannes Verveline. And the government of New York colony thought it would be a better idea for him to move his ferry up to Spite and Dial. So this guy, Verveline, moved his ferry operation up to 230th Street and Broadway. And the island of Paprinnament was given to Verveline, and he was ordered to build an inn or a tavern on the site. And interestingly, in 1668, an enslaved man, enslaved African man belonging to Verveline, is recorded as piloting this ferry when it was still in Harlem. So it's very possible that it was an enslaved African named Mathis doing that ferrying up in Spite and Dial. So, in addition to operating the ferry, Verveline was required to have an inn or a tavern. And he was given a monopoly, so the government basically set forth what he was allowed to charge. And I love this one. For lodging any person, 8 pence per night, in case they have a bed with sheets. And without sheets, 2 pence in silver. Some other interesting things here. I thought this was kind of funny. I know this isn't what it really means, but it says, for a single horse, 6 pence. I just imagine a horse wandering down to the tavern. And then down here, let's see. For droves of cattle to be driven over and opening the gates, 2 pence per piece. So what happened was this ferry gave Verveline the right to charge people to cross, so the local farmers got really annoyed that they had to pay this guy. So the government let Verveline fence off the waiting place. So he put a gate there to charge people to cross. So we don't know that much about what happened here in the colonial period, but we do have, luckily back then people wrote these travel diaries. So when they hit the road, they keep a book by their side and write down what their daily experiences were like. So we have some of those. So here's a view looking west, and I put the, even though this is from 1776, a little bit later than what we're talking about, I'm including it because it sort of reminds me of this travel diary written by Jasper Bankerts in 1679. And he wrote in his travel diary, he's traveling north up Manhattan to today's Bronx, and he says, we proceeded on our way, and when we were not far from the point of Spite and Dial, we could see on our left hand the rocky cliffs of the mainland on the other side of the North River. And I love talking about New Jersey as the mainland. Then he writes, we crossed over the Spite and Dial in a canoe and paid 9 stivers fare for us 3, which was very dear. And it is funny, these travel diaries, a running theme is complaints about the ferry and the tavern. Now, Johannes Verveline's ferry is commemorated in the streets of Kingsbridge by this alley back here with no addresses on it. That's about 100 feet long, called Verveline Place. Can you imagine a canoe paddling there? So the ferry and the tavern run by Verveline lasted a few decades. Then it passed to this guy, Frederick Phillips, the proprietor of Phillipsburg Manor, 1693. Some refer to him as the Lord of Phillipsburg Manor because he was given a grant by King William and Queen Mary of England in 1693, a royal charter that gave him the right to do to hold a court, to charge rent, and he owned basically from where we are to the Croton River in Westchester. So if you hopped on the train here at a rail station, you could ride for about 45 minutes and you'd still be on this property. So this charter, this grant that given to him by the king, said that we grant unto our said loving subject a certain neck or island of land called Paprinamino, adjoining to the land or aforesaid, with all the salt meadows thereunto belonging, together with the power and authority to erect a bridge over the water or river commonly called Spikeden Dival Ferry or Paprinimo. So you see that word Paprinamon right in there. And so that bridge, of course, was the King's Bridge, built in 1693. And so
they didn't have easy pass.
they did not have easy pass. So some interesting things about Phillips here. He's an interesting character that really could be an HBO miniseries because he came to New Amsterdam as a carpenter. He wheeled and dealed and hustled his way to becoming the wealthiest man in New York colony, buying low and selling high on commodities, but also real estate. He was also pretty much the colony's biggest slave trader. And he was smuggling enslaved Africans into New York illegally, supplying Red Sea pirates with gunpowder and liquor in exchange for enslaved people. And he married a very wealthy widow who owned many merchant ships, and that what led to his fame and fortune.
Did he end up on the wrong side of the revolution?
So this is before the revolution, but his descendants did. And that actually plays a role in this little red dot here at the hook of 230th and Broadway. So it was, I mentioned he was a slave trader. It's very likely that enslaved people built that bridge, or at least worked on it. So part of what made it such a sweet spot for a tavern is the fact that two of America's oldest roads meet in our neighborhood, Kingsbridge, the Albany Post Road and the Boston Post Road. And the Albany Post, and these two meet at the current present-day intersection of Albany Crescent, sort of makes sense, and West 231st Street, so about where the Piper's Kilt was. Sort of forget what it's called now. So anybody traveling through on land to get to New York City to cross the Kingsbridge would have to pass this tavern. It's sort of like having a rest stop on a highway. And just funneled customers. Here's a great picture of the photo of the last days of the King's Bridge. And this may not be the most illustrative diary entry, but in 1704, Sarah Kemble Knight wrote in her travel diary, "About 5 come to Spikeden Dival, else Kingsbridge, where they pay 3 pence for passing over with a horse, which the man that keeps the gate set up at the end of the bridge receives." So yes, it was an in-person toll collection there. Now, the tavern itself, so Frederick Phillips, he may have operated the tavern directly for a while or had an employee, but he eventually just leased the tavern, the bridge, and the island to different proprietors. In the 1740s, at least, it was owned by someone named Francis Doughty. Now, a travel diary of a New England doctor named Dr. Alexander Hamilton, not the Alexander Hamilton, a different guy, tells you a little bit about what it was like in Doughty's Tavern there at today's Dunkin Donuts. This is a different tavern, but maybe on a real fun night, Doughty's Tavern may have looked like this. So, coming probably on the Boston Post Road, Dr. Alexander Hamilton wrote, "Coming from New Rochelle at 4 o'clock, I put up this night at Doughty's. who keeps house at Kingsbridge, a fat man much troubled with rheumatism and of a hasty, passionate temper. So this whole thing is like, he goes on a bit, this whole thing's like a bad Yelp review. So he writes, I supped upon roasted oysters while my landlord ate roasted ears of corn at another table. He kept the whole house in a stir to serve him, and yet could not be pleased. This night proved very stormy and threatened rain. I was disturbed again in my rest by the noise of a heavy tread of a foot in the room above. That wherein I lay was so large and lofty that any noise echoed as if it had been in a church. Loud hotel room. These are some oyster shells that you see on the floor of Riverdale Forest even today. In the morning he wrote this. I saw about 10 Indians fishing for oysters in the gut, which I think means like a ditch, before the door. The wretches waded about stark naked and threw the oysters as they picked them up with their hands into baskets that hung upon their left shoulder. So, actually that date is wrong, it's 1744, sorry about that. So, this would have been something similar to what Dr. Alexander Hamilton was looking at. This is that corner of, imagine this is 230th Street, the old Spike Namel Creek. This is pretty much Broadway here. This is that corner, there's that red dot. And this work of art was made by a traveling French artist, Jacques Lebert, in 1820. And you'll notice even then, what are these folks doing? Oystering, yeah. And this area, where the Spike Namel Creek curved around Marble Hill, particularly because of this island here, it provided enough shelter for the oysters. You know, oyster won't grow in a very turbulent water, but this place was very well known for its oysters. There were commercial oyster enterprises here. There was, at the end of the Kingsbridge, there was an oyster shack owned by the Berrien family. Now, where that island was, there's a traffic island. And the business is probably better now at the Dunkin Donuts than it was for Frederick Phillips's Tavern, as there seemed to be a real high turnover of tenants there, particularly after 1748. Here's an ad in the paper from 1749. To be let and entered upon immediately the house, farm, and bridge at Kingsbridge in the manor of Phillipsburg in the county of Westchester. For particulars, inquire of Frederick Phillips. So this, I think, is the grandson of that first Frederick Phillips. Now, the reason why there may have been high turnover there has something to do with this. So, this is an article in the 1758 New York Gazette advertising that on the 28th of this instant December, the free bridge erected and built across the Harlem River will be finished and completed. And it boasts no tollage, locks, or bars to hinder. So the deal here was local people got tired of paying a toll, so they decided they were going to build their own bridge. And so, Marble Hill, this is 230th Street and Broadway here, there's the tavern, there's the King's Bridge. The locals decided they were going to build their own bridge, and this probably was terrible for business for the tavern and the bridge here, because you could just cross for free here. And guess what? Some of those people that worked to build this free bridge, they built their own tavern right here. So anybody coming from Lower Manhattan would see this tavern before they saw the Phillips Tavern. I was able to identify an inn holder from 1764. This is to give notice to all gentlemen, ladies, and others that James Barnard, inn holder at Kingsbridge, has to dispose of a collection of choice canary birds in full plumage and song. And it says to send a line directed to said James Barnard, inn holder at the Bunch of Grapes at Kingsbridge. So that's the name of the establishment. Whoops. a bunch of grapes. You can imagine an old-timey inn with a sign painted on it, of grapevines painted on a wood panel dangling over the door. Now, I'm not sure if James Barnard was the kind of employer you'd want, because in 1760, his apprentice ran away, Samuel Phillips, an apprentice of middle stature, about 18-year-olds, has dark brown hair, and so he describes this guy and says that masters of vessels and others are forbid to carry him off at their peril. And, if you look at historical documents, you do see, runaway ads, not only for enslaved people that are running away to seek freedom, but also these apprentices who were often horribly exploited.
Would that be the same as like an indentured servant?
Yes. And so pretty much. You would sign although there may have been, with an apprentice, there may have been more of an expectation that you would be learning the craft as well. But, to become an apprentice, you would sign an agreement where you would, promise to obey your master's commands, essentially.
I think a parent would put you into it.
Mm-hmm. So, also, James Barnard held an enslaved Negro man named Windsor, about 23 years of age, short stature, and Windsor ran away. And it looks like he may have been some kind of waiter or something, because he's wearing a frock livery coat with yellow collar and buttonholes, a white shirt and waistcoat. So he's kind of wearing a uniform, like you might see in a fancy hotel. And in fact, a enslaved man was sold at that site. Stout, able Negro man, slave, age 23, fit for town or country, has been used to wait on a gentleman, inquire of the printer or of James Bernard, innholder at Kingsbridge. So this site is not immune to everything that was happening in colonial America. So you might be noticing that I'm using a lot of these maps from the American Revolution with these forts on them. Including this British headquarters map from 1782. And that's because it was mapped so many times. It was a strategic spot during the American Revolution because of those bridges, the Kingsbridge and the Free Bridge. But before the war started, there's not really evidence of a lot of revolutionary activity in our area. That was mostly down in lower Manhattan. But people in our area definitely would have caught wind of events because, well, we're on the Albany and the Boston Post Road, so travelers would come bringing news. By the time the Revolution rolled around, James Barnard went bankrupt, and the next person to hold the tavern at the Kingsbridge was a man named John Cock.
Now that fort on the upper right, where would that be today?
The fort on the upper right, so Peter Ostrander might be better able to say, but I believe it's Giles Place, Cannon Place.
Oh yeah, by the reservoir.
Mm-hmm. That's Fort Independence. That was the main large fortification in the area. Kingsbridge Heights. So the tavern with the tenant that was paying a rent to Phillips at this time during the Revolution was a man named John Cock. And riders would come through on the Boston Post Road, such as Paul Revere. 1774, this is like an invoice for his expenses to a journey of my horse to Kingsbridge, New York, 234 miles. He's bringing news of the British, the Boston Port Act that shut down the port of Boston. And he's spreading it far and wide to try to get other colonies to boycott British goods. Also stopping by was John Adams. On his way to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia, he writes in his diary, "Lodged at Cox at Kingsbridge, a pretty place, Uncas River running before the door and verdant hills all around." 1774. What's up with the Uncas River? That's probably the Yonkers River. And what's up with the verdant hills? I don't see any verdant hills. Where are they? So, it truly was a beautiful spot in those days. This is that same view 200 years earlier in 1820. So that's the Kingsbridge in the center with some mill buildings around it. This would be our street corner back there. So, going back to the Revolution, after the battles that started the war at Lexington and Concord, locals were ordered to form a militia of local men to protect the area. And so this is the vote for who would serve as captain, first lieutenant, second lieutenant, and ensign. And you see the captain, most people were voting for John Cock, the tavern keeper, as the captain, beating out Frederick Van Cortlandt, who's only got 5 votes. But there was a big problem, because when John Cock was asked to sign a General Association of Patriots, signaling his commitment to the Revolution, some of his neighbors claimed they overheard him say, "I signed this with my hand, but not with my heart. For I would not have signed it had it not been for my wife and family's sake." And he also allegedly damned the Continental Congress. Hard to believe someone speaking ill of Congress, right? So, back in those days, people liked Congress. They even temporarily renamed the King's Bridge Congress Bridge in 1776. So some local people petitioned to keep John Cock as the captain, and others insisted on redoing the election. He did end up losing that position as captain. And his story doesn't end there, because a group of revolutionaries in 1776 broke into Fort George, which is the Fort Lower Manhattan in those days, and they seized the British cannons and brought them up to Kingsbridge for safekeeping, to keep them out of British hands, but they weren't safe. They were all spiked or ruined and were sabotaged, as they were not well guarded. And a memoir of a local inhabitant, it was none other than John Cock, the tavern keeper, who sabotaged those cannons. And that wasn't it. So, shortly after the Declaration of Independence was read down at City Hall, on July 9, 1776, the soldiers, all riled up, decided they were going to tear down the statue of King George at Bowling Green. And they took down the statue, they cut off the nose, they shot musket balls at the king's head. They were planning of putting the head at the end of a flagpole. And that's when a British military engineer named John Montresor, he sent 2 tavern keepers on a secret mission. And one of them was John Cock, and that mission was to rescue the king's head. So John Cock and this other tavern keeper, Corby, they broke into the rebel camp to rescue the king's head. They did do it. They got it. And Cock buried it somewhere, maybe in the Dunkin Donuts parking lot. And in fact, nobody knows where that head is today. Although it was last reported to be in England. The tale is in the collection of the New York Historical Society. So it's amazing to me, because you see in these, this is an order book of the Dutchess County Militia Regiment. So our area was just teeming with soldiers, patriot soldiers in 1776. And here's this tavern keeper in the middle of it all, doing these secret missions for the British. And it says, brigade orders a guard to mount to mount tomorrow morning and to parade at Mr. Cock's house. So right next to the tavern, the troops were drilling. He just, and with comments like you're about to see, I don't know how he kept his secret, because General Nathaniel Greene was writing a letter to his wife and said, "The enemy are at Kingsbridge, on the ground where you met with the insults from the tavern keeper." So, at that red dot there, corner of 230th Street and Broadway, There were court-martial proceedings held.
Nick, why does it say Kingsbridge down on the bottom left?
So that's a good question. It's a mistake. And one thing you'll see in a lot of these maps are mislabeled places. And often that led to a lot of bizarre things, like we're here on Independence Avenue, right?
Yeah.
So that's because of a mislabeled British map put Fort Independence on Slane Dial. But it's actually over here. You could find another mislabeled British map that labels Fort Independence here and Fort Independence there. So people, when they went to come up with names for streets, they looked at these old maps and came up with the wrong, inaccurate information. This little red dot here was the headquarters for various officers throughout the war. There were barracks built all around it that were destroyed by the Patriots when they had to flee. Cannonballs flew overhead when the Continental Army returned to probe the British defenses on Manhattan. So we do have one travel diary of someone who came through the area in 1778. She was from Boston. She was trying to reconnect with her husband down on Manhattan Island. She was stopped by the guard at the Kingsbridge. And she had this to say in her diary: "There's nothing but gammon and eggs to eat at this tavern." She was in great distress. She says, "I was in great distress, but what could I do? In a public house, no person to take care of me. I went to bed in a very small room, 3 beds in it, full as much dirt as you could well wade through. A pair of sheets, they assured me, had never been lodged in, but ironed on until they were of a dark brown. However, after reasoning myself into a composed mind, I had a tolerable night." I have yet to read one positive review. So it's unclear who was really running the tavern during the war, because John Cock apparently fled. The war was probably not great for business, a lot less travelers, plus all the soldiers were getting rum rations. They didn't need to go to a tavern. After the war, the tavern, the island of Paprineman, and all the rest of Frederick Phillips's land at this site was auctioned off because of his loyalty to the king, as someone mentioned earlier. And it was purchased by a brewer named Medcalf Eden. And this is a little alley downtown, Eden's Alley, named after him. Here's some ads. He was a brewer. He's advertising hot ale, cider, all sorts of stuff. He probably did well during the Revolution because all these soldiers needed beer and cider. And he leased out the tavern to some guy named Mason Waddles, who ran a stagecoach from the city to here. Here he's advertising an elegant coach and 4 excellent horses with a careful driver to run every day in the week from this city to his house at Kingsbridge. So very smart. You own the coach and you own the tavern at the end. Here's kind of a funky map. There's this ad on the right just to show that these guys, Daniel, Halsey, and Waddles, were working together. And you see this map on the left here is pretty interesting. It's a road map showing basically Broadway coming north on Manhattan Island with no features around it, but it does have the mile markers on the old post road. And then here, it crosses the Kingsbridge. There's that hook. And there you see Halsey's, as in Halsey's Tavern, which is what was known in the 1790s. He died in 1798, Medcalf Eden, that is, leaving a fortune to his sons, who basically gambled and partied until they lost everything. Then, the site was purchased by this guy, Alexander Macomb, who was a merchant and speculator. And not only did he own this property, he owned a mansion on Lower Broadway, which he leased to George Washington for use as the presidential mansion. And he also owned 3,670,715 acres in New York State, upstate, which is about 1/8 of the total territory of New York State. This was a rich guy. And on the Spite and Idle Creek, he built a mill. This giant mill with 9 pairs of millstones in it. And it was producing flour. One newspaper article I found from 1808 showed that they were shipping out 22,500 pounds of flour in one shipment. And this is what it looks like today. Here's another view of that mill with the Kingsbridge in front of it. The investment in this property didn't work out. The investment in land upstate didn't work out. He ended up in debtor's prison, Alexander McComb. His son, Robert McComb, who was an engineer, he took possession of the house at 230th and Broadway in 1810. And he's the engineer who came up with the idea of McComb's Dam. You ever see that on the Major Deegan Expressway, the signs for McComb's Dam or McComb's Dam Bridge? And he had that dam built to control the flow of water through the Harlem River to better power those mills on the Spite and Idle Creek. And he had ambitions of turning Kingsbridge into an industrial center with, I don't know how many mills are here, just looks like maybe a dozen different mills and warehouses and loading docks and everything. This was his plan. He was planning on flooding the entire valley of Kingsbridge and building a dam to power these mills. Now, you remember the previous owner of the brewer, Medcalf Eden. His sons basically gambled away their fortune, but one son and the grandchildren thought they had a legal case to get the property back. So they approached the chair of the New York bar, or one of the leaders of the New York bar, Alexander Hamilton, to try to recover their lost land, including this property here at Pat Brenneman. And Alexander Hamilton told them that they didn't have a case. So if Alexander Hamilton told them they didn't have a case, guess who told them they did have a case? Aaron Burr. So Aaron Burr represented the Edens, and what became a landmark case, he was able to recover that Kingsbridge property for the Eden family, although it worked out that the widow of Robert McComb just ended up paying the Eden descendants to own the land. And Mary McComb ended up parceling out this whole island of Pat Brenneman into separate lots and sold them off in the 1800s. And that little corner down here, this is 230th and Broadway, this was purchased by someone named Joseph Godwin, who was a carriage maker. There's a little close-up. You can see the word mansion labeled there in the bottom right. And you can see they did make some headway industrializing the Spite and Idle Creek. There's the mill, there's a wharf there. This was like I think it's a sluice way, they might call it that, for the mill. There's that little island you saw in one of the earlier drawings. It became known as Godwin's Island. And the mansion was a real local landmark treasured by local people. Beautiful. People were very sad when it was torn down, I believe in 1915. Now, take note of these trees around here. The trees also became something of a local landmark. I think they're English elms that were beloved by people in the neighborhood. Here's a side view, maybe looking from the King's Bridge, looking towards the McComb Mansion, or the Godwin Mansion. And you'll notice there's this front part that you kind of see in all the postcards and stuff, and then there's this other part behind here, and I think this bears the closest resemblance to those early drawings of the tavern. So maybe this was the original tavern and they added a Victorian mansion attached to it. The Godwins sold off that little island in the center of the Spite and Idle Creek in 1899, apparently a favorite haunt of the Godwin children. It was sold to create this bridge so that Broadway can continue from Manhattan over to Kingsbridge in the Bronx on the other side. You can see a little sliver of that Godwin's mansion there at the corner of 230th and Broadway. Here's a look shortly after the Spite and Idle Creek was filled in. This is 230th Street, running left to right there. You see the elevated subway or elevated train here. There's that corner. And you can see just how much higher West 230th Street is than the naturally occurring street level here.
Any information as to where all the fill came from?
Where did all the fill come from? Grand Central Terminal is what I'm hearing from the crowd.
Now, that was later when they were raising the level.
Oh, that was later when they were raising the level. Okay, then I'm not sure. I really don't know. So these filled-in swamps, of course, made plenty of available real estate for the building of the Marble Hill houses, which would be in the foreground there today. Before the Marble Hill houses were built, there was a baseball field there. Just a gorgeous building. And those elm trees, those English elms, you see them even in later pictures after the house was torn down. This is the 20s. There was a municipal gas station put on the corner. I think there was a gas station there until after the year 2000, maybe 2002, something like that. They took that down. This building's still there. This little brown house is still there. There's a parking lot in here somewhere. These trees were so beloved that when they went to build the post office, someone thought it would be a good idea to film them being chopped down. This is 1950 or 51, I believe. We have this 8mm film reel in our archives that is just awesome. I'll show you the whole thing if you come to a later meeting. But just to have this in color too is really, really cool. But in these films from the 50s, you see old timers walking down the street, and these are people that that when they were children, they were living in Yonkers and Westchester County, and there was this Spike and Ivel Creek flowing through, and they witnessed all these changes. It's no wonder they wanted to record it, film it, and start a historical society. This is definitely not OSHA compliant, whatever's going on. I feel like trees are something that we think of when we think about the passage of time and witnessing the past. We look at a big old tree. So this is across the street when they're putting in the foundation for the Marble Hill houses. So this is, you can see how far down they are from 230th Street up there. You see that stone wall right there? That's the old stone wall that lines the Spike and Ivel Creek. They've got a mansion in the distance. And like I said, it was a gas station until a little after the year 2000. It became a Dunkin Donuts a few years later. That's Nahar behind the counter. Her family is from Bangladesh, and she's been running the place for about 20 years. She told me that the area is a lot different than Bangladesh. But she said that people do good and bad things no matter where you go. And her business is doing very well. And in fact, they have about a dozen employees. And she's doing better than some of the richest people in the history of the state of New York, Lord Frederick Phillips and Alexander McComb. She hasn't had any employees run away. This was like the first place of business I went to in this neighborhood. I was living down in the city, would stop here through the drive-thru on my way to teach at PS24. And so I thought I would leave her with a little gift. which is now hanging in the Dunkin Donuts. So that's it, folks.
Do you have the Dunkin' app on your phone?
I should have started by saying I have no affiliation with Dunkin Donuts, and I'm not being paid by Dunkin Donuts. We probably could have at least gotten some free coffee out of it. Are there any questions about anything that I mentioned?
Where was the free bridge approximately?
So the free bridge was where 225th Street is today in front of Target. And that was filled in, and shortly thereafter, the New York Yankees started building their first stadium there on that site. They built the infield, and then for some reason or another, they decided they were going to build it somewhere else, where the original house that Ruth built was built. Anything else? Yes.
Some of the maps showed some fortifications up on the hill on the west side.
Yeah, so some of those fortifications were right around here. I mean,
Yeah. Are there any ruins or anything there?
that's kind of a sore spot because Peter Ostrander and I, we tried to do a little archaeological dig on this site at the end of Fairfield Avenue and what street, Peter? 230th Street, just before it developed. The developer had bought it, it was like a vacant lot for a long time. And they were putting up luxury homes, you know. And so the developer gave us a really hard time. They wanted us to sign like a legal release that we wouldn't say anything if we found anything. It was just like all kind of. But anyway, I think there is some reason, to give you a little bit of a cliffhanger, I think there is some reason to believe that there still might be some remnants of fortifications here in the hills right now. But there were 3 numbered forts up here, Fort 1, 2, and 3, to basically prevent an army from coming up from Westchester County to come south and take New York City.
So the house where Van Cortlandt house is in Van Cortlandt Park?
Yes.
That's not the original location of his house, of Van, what's his name?
Frederick Van.
Frederick Van Cortlandt had the house built. No, that they first bought land in the park, in today's park, in 1693, and that house was built in 1748, 1749. So there's a whole history of basically, other than that street corner, that part of Van Cortlandt Park is the next most, or maybe the most historic spot in the neighborhood, because there was a settlement there as well.
Okay, his house actually was there or wasn't there?
Well, I mean, before 1748, it wasn't there. And you know, they were rich merchants that lived down in New York City. And this was kind of like their country estate.
Oh, I see.
Yes.
Where did Bailey come from? It's not on any of the maps.
The name?
No, the whole street. I mean, it was Broadway, and it was Albany Crescent, but the maps don't have a Bailey.
You know,
Back then.
there are certain Revolutionary era maps that do show like paths that eventually became streets, and I feel like there may have been one that closely mimics the route of Bailey Avenue.
But it's also sort of an Irish name, isn't it? I just wondered.
Well, there was a man named N.P. Bailey who had a mansion just below the hill from the Veteran Hospital. Beautiful Victorian, we have some great photos of him. But I can't remember what he did. He wasn't Barnum and Bailey, I know that. That was a theory for a while. Yes?
The video, I call it a video, with the tree being felled is kind of poignant when you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if people are familiar with the huge and very ancient tree on the site of what used to be the Visitation Grade School.
Cottonwood tree?
Yes, yeah.
That thing is amazing because
Do you know if any efforts are being made to make sure it survives?
I don't know. But if you walk through that neighborhood at the right time, it's like snowing. There's so much of that cottonwood tree, cotton falling down. So what's the cross street there? It's Vancourt, it's like Vancourt Park South and.
A review place.
Yeah, and like I was saying, people, when the society was founded in 1949, there were these people around who could tell you, like, yeah, there used to be we used to sail here on 230th Street, And so, and the trees coming down and the old mansions coming down, you can understand why people thought, well, we have to preserve our history. Yes?
Do you know where Boss Tweed's house was?
We're there.
Like Half Moon,
Yeah, I think we have some photos of that as well. And I know, Stephanie Coggins, you looked into that, right?
Yeah.
Where exactly?
Yeah.
So where would that be? Could you describe?
Well,
Like half moon overlook?
whether it's on the north side of the street or whether it's below where the half moon overlook is, because there were stairs that I saw in a photograph in the Riverdale Press.
There remains of the house down there.
Yeah, but I have been doing some research, because I've been doing some research on Shorefront Park. That was the one of the 3 parcels that makes up Spidey Shorefront Park.
Okay.
But I haven't put it all together yet.
That was when he was girlfriend was mistress. He didn't live there. He was in the
Yeah, sure, that makes sense. All right, and this will be the last one. If you wanted to ask anything else, just hang out after. Yes?
when did the Marble Hill houses open? When were they constructed?
So, in this film, 1951, you see them under construction. And I think they opened officially in 1951. And most of the first inhabitants were veterans from World War II. Like the overwhelming majority were veteran families. Okay, folks, thank you. Thanks for sticking around in the poll. I recorded it, so I'll put it on YouTube. Yeah. That was great. Oh, hey, yeah. That was great. Oh, thank you.